For part 3 of chapter 1, we're going to be talking about the very earliest stages of psychology. And up to this point, we've talked about the fact that psychology has a really long history, but didn't quite come into being until about the 1870s. And we're finally at that point where we can talk about who is heralded as the father of modern psychology and some of the thought processes, some of the ways of thinking that were really common at the time. So we're going to focus on structuralism and functionalism as two almost opposing schools of thought from this early period in psychology's history. So first off, starting with structuralism, and as I've said before, the credited father of modern psychology, who is Wilhelm Wundt. And I think I've mentioned this before, but just in case I'll say it again, I've included dates here just to help everybody sort of put things into perspective, put things along a timeline. However, those dates are not the important fact here. What we care about is the fact that Wundt was the individual who started what we think of as modern psychology. They established the first psychological laboratory. They even taught the first psychology courses and published the first psychology textbooks. So this is the individual that we can credit for how psychology is today, at least the starting point. So what was that starting point? As a structuralist, as our founding structuralist, Wundt thought that psychology is something that should be using scientific techniques to try and study the rules that determine how the human mind combines and relates various pieces of information. It's a little bit of a typo. I will definitely fix that. But what this means in sort of simpler terms is we're starting to move into this idea that scientific techniques are important, and we can use these scientific techniques to try and understand the basic elements of the human mind. Now, this move towards scientific approaches actually started back with our British empiricists because, while we didn't mention it at the time, that concept of empiricism is all about gaining information. And we had talked about it with the empiricists as we learn about our environment through experience and through our senses and seeing things happen in the real world. But it can also be applied to scientific techniques because here we're gaining our scientific knowledge through things like observing things as they happen. And of course, that's really important for what science is, where we are using non-biased observations. Now, structuralism is not exactly unbiased, but we'll get to that momentarily. First, we should get our actual definition of structuralism, some of which must already be clear from what Wundt was thinking, but we're going to talk about structuralism as this school of thought that's focused on analyzing our basic elements of the human mind, and specifically trying to figure out what each of those elements are. And they were very much focused on our feelings and our sensations, the sort of experiences that we're having. One of the students of Wundt, Edward Titchener, actually had a technique, something that has been used sort of on and off throughout history, something called introspection. And this is one of the techniques that they were trying to use to better understand our experiences by breaking those experiences down into their different elemental components. So we're taking our subjective experiences, something we mentioned before as part of that sort of idealism versus realism debate, where we had said that when we're experiencing our environment, and we know that we experience things slightly differently. Each person might attend to different factors in their environment. They might miss something, or they might connect things. So everything that we experience is subjective. It's almost interpreted through the lens of our experience. And Titchener said, all right, well, if our experiences are subjective, can we actually break it down into those individual elements that build up that subjective interpretation? And again, we're seeing these empirical observations. We're trying to get a more systematic process here. So introspection is our systematic process for looking within or reflecting on their own individual internal experiences. And this is something they wanted to use to have self-observation, basically observe, document, record, and then analyze their interpretations of their own feelings. They focused on sensations, what they were experiencing, things that they could touch and smell and taste. All those sensations were considered to be the basic elements of consciousness, and each sensation added together to give us that more subjective whole of our experience of our environment. So, a lot of stuff going on, but as we start seeing all of these concepts build on things that came earlier. So, what's our next individual to talk about here? This is actually William James. And James was somebody who started our opposing school of thought. So, if our structuralists were focused on understanding the basic nature and the elemental components that make up the human mind, our functionalists really took things in a very different direction, and they decided to focus on the function and the origin of the mind. So if you think about it, structuralism focused on the structure, the individual elements, the components and building blocks. Functionalism looks at the function and where those functions came from. So very different schools, but they each had focuses that built up into what psychology is today. So, just in terms of timing, James came around after Wundt had established our sort of ideas of psychology to begin with, and liked psychology as a concept, but didn't love the structuralist approach to framing the human mind. So, instead, decided to focus on investigating the function or purpose of consciousness, basically asking, what does the mind really do? So, functionalism is our opposing school of thought that's going to focus on the adaptive significance of mental processes. And this idea of adaptive significance is a new concept. We haven't touched on this yet. But this is strongly influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution, which was holding a lot of, say, popular sway at the time. This was something that was influencing a lot of sciences in this moment. And just a brief refresher, if you're not familiar with Darwin's theory of evolution, the most basic version of it that we're going to talk about now, with more detail to come, says that adaptation is going to be a process that allows organisms to survive and reproduce. Usually we'll see this simplified to the concept of survival of the fittest. And that's of course an oversimplification, but we're going to talk about it as if you have certain abilities, certain processes, certain traits, or certain ways of thinking, if we're looking at mental processes, that make you better adapted to survive in your current environment, you're going to be better at avoiding predators, you're going to be better at surviving food or finding food, then that means that you yourself are more likely to survive for a longer period of time. And if we have an organism that survives for a longer period of time and others who are less well adapted, who maybe don't have those same beneficial mental traits, they're going to die off earlier. And that just means that those better adapted organisms are going to be the ones that reproduce and lead to the sort of next generation of that population. So the individuals that survive longer have traits that let them survive longer, and those traits get passed on through reproduction. And in that new generation, those individuals who inherited those traits also survive better and live longer and reproduce more. So, if we're looking at this through functionalism and what James and others within this sort of thought process were thinking, they had the idea that there must be these mental traits that give us some sort of benefit. And if humans are the product of years and years and years of evolution, of this adaptation leading to sort of better survival in the future, if natural selection has led to these traits becoming common in the human population, then they must have some benefit to us. So when we look at our mental processes, when we look at what we're capable of doing, it must be something that makes us better, that makes us survive longer, that allows us to function more in our environment. And then, as per usual for these ideas where I've kind of thrown a bunch of terms around, I want to take a step back and give us an example to try and illustrate this, maybe give some clarification or help solidify understanding. But if we think of the fact that humans respond very well to flashing lights, we're having our attention drawn to things like emergency vehicles, fantastic example. Sirens and flashing lights, those are things that are going to pull our attention really quickly. And that's a good thing. Certain stuff is going to draw our attention. And while flashing lights on an emergency vehicle is not necessarily part of a natural environment where we would have been evolving the ability to pay attention to these lights, we can think of times where, say, back in our ancestors hunting and gathering, things that appear suddenly or things that make loud sounds could be threats. So there's a predator sneaking up on you. You get a flash of something in your environment out of the corner of your eye, and it wasn't there before. Well, if that's a predator and you have an adaptation that allowed you to recognize it and process that information quickly, and then maybe produce a defensive response, that means you're a lot more likely to survive than someone who doesn't have that mental capacity. So it gives you an idea of natural selection, sort of making these adaptations more likely in the future, because having that trait, having that adaptation, let you survive and go on to reproduce, passing that perceptual ability on to your offspring. And that thought process, that logicking our way through what are the potential benefits from this in our evolutionary past, and what abilities do we see in the future that would have come from that, that's what functionalism was all about. So again, we're stressing here the difference between these two fields, with structuralism looking at the elemental components and functionalism focusing on function and use and the adaptive ability of all of our cognitive processes. That's the focus for this section.